Thank you, Mr. Paisley. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. I beg to move that this House has considered the regulation of elections and finances. Before I start my remarks, I'd just like to say what a pleasure it is to see the Minister in her place here in Westminster Hall this afternoon. And this debate has come at a timely moment as the government has published its elections bill this week, and yesterday the Committee on Standards and Public Life published its report on regulation of election finance, which has been a lengthy review which the committee has conducted. I myself was interviewed by the committee as part of its work in relation to my work chairing the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee's inquiry on disinformation and fake news. I'd like to thank the Minister as well for giving me the chance to discuss the elections bill with her and her officials some months ago before it was published. It's very important that we have these periodic reviews of election law because technology changes the way we live our lives. It also changes the way in which elections are fought, and regulations have to keep pace with changes to society. At the heart of good election regulation, I believe, are two fairly simple and fundamental things which have stood us in good stead through the ages and are important. It's important they're translated into the modern world, and that is transparency of funding and transparency in campaigning. We all know that when we've delivered leaflets in our constituencies in elections, there is an imprint on those leaflets that tells you who paid for those leaflets and who they're there to promote. There is no existing provision for online campaigning at the moment, and given that online campaigning, particularly campaigning on Facebook, plays a much bigger part in everyone's campaigning now, that's increasingly important that it does. And that's why I welcome the fact that the government is recommending the introduction of electronic imprints as a legal requirement in its bill, which I think is a very necessary reform. But one of the big challenges we face now is not campaigning under our party banners. To an extent, we all have a bit of personal jeopardy if we put leaflets out with a party logo or our names on. There's an assumption that it belongs to us. Well, of course, as recent by-elections have shown, it's also possible that people put out leaflets without necessarily saying who they are as well. So it's not a purely online phenomenon, but one that is increasingly important in the online world. But the role of non-party campaign organisations, not official registered party groups, campaigning with increasing resources and increasing funding, and not just in election periods but throughout the year on issues, I think it is important that there is some understanding of where their funding comes from when they are seeking to campaign on a political issue. This is not something that is solely a problem in the UK. This is a problem around the world. In 2019, I attended the International Grand Committee of Parliamentarians in Ottawa in Canada. That was a meeting of parliamentarians who were mainly interested in digital campaigning, in disinformation and the role of elections in the online world. It was the second such meeting. The first meeting of the International Grand Committee was one I chaired in this room as part of the DCMS Select Committee's inquiry on disinformation and fake news. But at that meeting, one of the witnesses in Ottawa that we questioned was Ellen Weintraub, the Commissioner for the Federal Election Commission in the United States. And what she said there with regards to the area I'd like to turn to first, which is online donations, she set out the problem as she saw it in America, and I think there are a lot of parallels that other people around the world, including here, would agree with as well. And this is what she said. This is the quote I will read from the transcript of her testimony, and it was in response to a question that I asked her about the difficulty of tracking money online. She said, "Our entire system of regulation is based on the assumption that large sums of money are what we need to worry about, and that this is where we should focus our regulatory activity. On the internet, however, sometimes very small amounts of money can be used to have vast impact. And that doesn't even get to the possibility of Bitcoin and other technologies being used to entirely mask where the money is coming from. The problem with dark money is that you never really know who is behind it. There has been about $1 billion of dark money spent in our elections in the last 10 years, and I cannot tell you who is behind it. That's the nature of the darkness." And she concluded, "We have a constant stream of complaints about dark money. The case I just described to you is one of the foremost examples we've seen recently. It can be money that comes in through limited liability companies, and in that one particular case, it came through the domestic subsidiary of a foreign corporation." End of quote. So I think she sets out there the very real nature of the problem. It's very easy to transfer money in very small amounts anywhere in the world, very difficult to trace. and that money is being donated into political campaigns of whatever nature, then it's difficult to know what the original source of that funding is. And I think we need to be very mindful of that in the digital age. Just before the last general election, I chaired a select committee session, a DCMS select committee session with PayPal. And it was very interesting there. PayPal gave an answer about this, which is similar to the answer you often get from technology companies about the things that happen on their systems, which is their view was it wasn't their responsibility to know what the source of funding was, or indeed whether funding was permissible when someone made a political donation through their systems. So if someone overseas made a political donation to a political party in the UK, the platform that's facilitating the transaction says it has no obligation to know or check, even though it is being used to facilitate what would be an offence. The liability rests entirely with the party receiving the funding. But I don't think necessarily these payment platforms should necessarily have no role in supervising what goes on, and at least setting their settings so that it is clearer where the source, at least the country of origin of that donation is. And again, I know this is something that the Minister has looked at, and the Government has looked at in its elections bill to try and make sure there is greater transparency on foreign donations, and I think that is very important. The Standards and Public Life Committee have made some specific recommendations, which I think also merit consideration. One is in particular that company donations should not exceed net profits after tax generated in the UK within the 2 preceding years. I think this is very helpful. Businesses make donations to political campaigns. I've had business people in my constituency in Kent who've made donations to my political campaigns. It's a perfectly proper form of donation, but we all know that it's really clear who the companies are, and they have to declare just as an individual would declare. I think we should be guarded against shell companies being used to make large donations when those companies aren't particularly turning any profit, because the question will rightly be asked, well, was the money transferred to that company so it could then make a donation, but it didn't generate that cash, therefore where did it really come from? So I think the Committee on Standards in Public Life is right to make that recommendation. I think it is worthy of consideration and debate. And I think too, another recommendation they made, this is recommendation 10 in their report, that all donations over £500 be donated through the banking system. And that does allow greater transparency on the source of funds. People have the option of making smaller donations through electronic payments and systems like PayPal. But if it is a larger amount, I think there's no guarantee that the money being paid through the banking system is a guarantee in itself of transparency. But I think it is a more transparent method. And I think, again, it's worthy of consideration what the threshold should be in that circumstance. But turning to political campaigning, as I've already said, I welcome the fact that the Minister is proposing in the bill to have electronic imprints on electronic campaign materials. But I think there should also be common standards in the way that the technology companies, the role that they perform in this regard as well. Some companies have ad libraries where they keep a store of all the ads that a particular campaign has placed. Facebook do that, and they also require that anyone placing an advert on Facebook has to have a Facebook page, and they have to have demonstrated to Facebook that they are a real person. But I know the Information Commissioner has spoken about the difficulty sometimes in tracking down who the real source of the campaign ads is, particularly when it is not a political party but a new organisation that has just been set up. So I think we do need to make sure we have high standards there so that people placing political ads are known, and they're known to be permissible advertisers. But ad libraries I don't think should be based, for political campaigns, I don't think should be necessarily based on the platform policies of the companies. I think it would be a good practice, and we should ask anyone who is advertising through online systems, through online platforms, that those platforms require that a record is an on-the-record record is kept of what those ads are. Ads on social media can be placed in the way of being dark ads, where targeted at individuals, not everyone else can see them, but I think it is useful to the democratic process to know, for everyone to be able to see what a campaign organisation is saying to its voters, even if it's not targeting those adverts at anyone, that someone could go and look up and check. And in the same way, I think for people to know why they're being targeted, again, there are systems, particularly on social media, where you can look at why you're receiving an advert, why it's being targeted at you. They're not necessarily standardised. I think that will be a good thing for people to be able to see if they were receiving a political message, why it is that they were. Is it because they've declared an affiliation for that party and therefore they're being targeted in that way? Is it for other reasons? But I think people should have the right to check, and there should be some standardised tools in that space as well. I think there also runs the question of what about ads that are fraudulent in elections, that are wrong and misleading, not just in terms of policy debate. I think it's very difficult to regulate political opinions. As we all know, politicians can give two totally different arguments on the same subject based on fact, but through different interpretation of those facts. You can't seem to regulate that, nor do we in this country. The fact that we have imprints on ads creates personal jeopardy for what we say. We have to put our name to what we say, and it can be traced back to us. But technology will take us in the near future to a place where deep fake films could be made of a politician saying something that was inflammatory on the eve of an election, something they've never said. In fact, it's a synthetic creation of them on film. And if that ad was being placed and run on social media, and it could be demonstrated and proven that this was fake, it wasn't based on real footage, what action is to be required then? Is there a required action of takedown by the social media companies? Would that content be considered illegal for electoral purposes, or would it be stopped? And I think we have to consider that new technology in the very near future will make that sort of campaigning very cheap, very easy to do, and I think we have to consider what our response to that would be. There's also the question too of the foreign placement of advertising. The much sort of talked about case in America in the 2016 presidential election of the Russians buying ads on Facebook to target voters in America, which was an offence there. And indeed, those sorts of foreign buys of ads to target voters here would be an offence too. And there are all countries, different countries around the world, not just the Russians, the Iranian government, other governments around the world that engage in the process of electoral interference in other countries. I think we should regard that as an offence having been committed. And if it is an offence that's been committed, and those ads have been identified as being run and being targeted at British voters, but I think there's a legitimate question to say, is that activity illegal? And if it's illegal, I think there are one of two things that we should consider about that, which is it's not just an offence committed by the person that's placed the ads, but it's an offence committed by the platform for running those ads, even though they're being run in breach of the law. The government's online safety bill will require social media companies and other technology companies to have policies in place to remove illegal content. So I think we need to consider, is an illegally placed ad, is an ad placed on social media targeting UK voters that is in itself illegal because it's based on a foreign agent doing that work? Should that require the social media company to remove it as a form of illegal content, as it would be required to do under the online safety bill? And indeed, in that situation, should it be the requirement of the regulator? Now, the draft online safety bill recommends that Ofcom be the regulator here. I think the question here whether that will be Ofcom for political ads or whether that should be the Electoral Commission or whichever is the most appropriate body. Should their task under the online safety bill, if we regard these ads as being illegal, be to say to the social media company, you must demonstrate to us not only that you would remove those ads if they were identified, but that you have systems in place to try and stop this happening. That you have systems in place to check when someone places the ad in the first place, if that is an illegal act, that it is identified and it is stopped. And therefore, that good practice should be that you take an interest in where in the world people are buying ads from, and when they do that, whether they're doing so in breach of electoral law. Now, I labour that point because I think it is important, because when we go back to the case in 2016, I remember questioning Facebook about that and whether they'd identified Russian ads that had run in America. Had they ever identified anything like that in the UK in the past, at previous elections or whenever? And they said, well, if you've got intelligence that happened, you can give that to us and we'll check. But what there is was no obligation for them to have those systems in place in the first place to preemptively stop it. If this was another form of fraud, like banking fraud, then banks are required to proactively look for and identify likely sources of fraud and to identify the authorities of something suspicious. Well, that doesn't exist in law in this case around the placement of ad in elections. And I think the combination of the elections bill and the online safety bill the government's bringing in, I think poses this natural question as to whether some forms of campaigning are illegal, and in that case whether the regulator should take a view not just on acting against them, but making sure the companies have got policies in place to make sure this sort of campaigning doesn't happen in the first place. I think these are all incredibly serious issues and important issues. I know, having spoken to the Electoral Commission about this as well, that they find it quite frustrating when dealing with technology companies to pursue lines of inquiry about suspicious activity, that unless they've launched a formal investigation, the company won't cooperate because they're under an obligation to do so. And again, I think we need to consider the powers of the Electoral Commission in this regard, both to make preliminary inquiries of a technology company about likely offences relating to digital adverts, but also to share information that they've discovered which could be relevant to the role of the work of the police or the work of the Information Commissioner as well. So I think it's important we consider those points. As I say, I think this is these are important issues, and I think to have this debate is timely given the welcome introduction of the Government's Elections Bill, the soon-to-start parliamentary scrutiny of the draft online safety bill, and the report of the Committee on Standards and Public Life. And that report is the first of its kind for 20 years, which shows that these things only come along periodically, but it's important that we get it right. Thank you.